888-971-SAGE, 888-971-7243, Larry Elder, ReliefFactor.com studio. In a few minutes, we're going to be speaking with Joel Kotkin, whose very lengthy article about how blue policies are damaging blue states, and therefore poor people and minorities living in those blue states are suffering disproportionately. That piece is up on LarryElder.com. We'll be talking with him in just a few minutes. I want to get back to these comments made about the black Attorney General Daniel Cameron, because the grand jury declined to recommend criminal charges in connection with the death of Breonna Taylor. The only charges that were recommended were three relatively minor charges called criminal endangerment, each count 5 years with a $15,000 fine. Frequently, people don't even serve any time if, in fact, they are convicted, and I think it's dubious as to whether or not he's going to be convicted. But the reaction to what the AG said by some of these people is stunning to me. This retired LAPD sergeant goes on MSNBC and says about Daniel Cameron, he may be skin folk, but not kinfolk. Co-founder of Black Lives Matter compares his press conference to a Bull Connor speech. Bull Connor is the sheriff, public superintendent of safety was his actual title, Birmingham, Alabama. I'm telling you, you got to keep the black and the white separate. She says to a black man who happened, by the way, to be married to a white one, at least she appeared to be white. She's comparing him to a segregationist. Why? Because the grand jury looked at the facts, looked at the law, and determined that the officers would not likely be convicted or they did bring charges. So that makes him Bull Connor. That makes him the subject of a slander. He may be skin folk, but he's not kinfolk. Ayanna Pressley last year at that Netroots conference, as I mentioned, said we don't need any more brown faces who don't want to be a brown voice. We don't need any more black faces who don't want to be a black voice. Nobody said squat. I did. Nobody else did. And that's what I want to ask you. Why is there silence? I don't care what race you are. That is an offensive thing to do. To compare this man to Bull Connor, to say he is skin folk, not kinfolk. What? That's okay? What, as a non-black person, you're not allowed to weigh in and say this is bigotry? This is racism. This is a suggestion that if you don't think a certain way, you're no longer black. Isn't that what Joe Biden said that caused him to walk it back and he apologized for it? Is anybody going to demand that she apologize? Of course not. Co-founder of Black Lives Matter apologize? Of course not. Is the media going to stick a mic in Nancy Pelosi's face and say, Speaker Pelosi, one of the members of the so-called squad said yesterday, we don't need any more brown faces who don't want to be a brown voice. We don't need any more black faces who don't want to be a black voice. What's your comment on that? It seems awfully bigoted to me, says the reporter. Of course not. I'm reminded of some years ago, the comedian Andrew Dice Clay became really, really popular. Why? Because he just did a bunch of silly nursery rhymes that we used to chant on playgrounds. And for some reason, a lot of people hadn't heard them, I guess. And it made him a superstar for a while. He was filling out basketball stadiums for a while. The National Organization of Women began to criticize him because he would refer to women as the B word and things like that. And when his movie Ford Fairlane came out, they organized campaigns to boycott it. Meanwhile, for years, comedians like Red Fox, Richard Pryor have been referring to women the same way, if not worse. And I'm not at all suggesting that there should have been some sort of movement against Andrew Dice Clay. After all, it is comedy. And people are paying money. They know what they're going to get. Go ahead. But can you at least be consistent? If it's offensive for Andrew Dice Clay to use demeaning terms for women, why isn't it offensive for black people to do it? But you didn't say squat because there's a no-fly zone over the black culture. Is that what it is? This is offensive to me. comparing this man to Bull Connor and nobody says anything?
This was an atrocity. And I watched that press conference this morning and noticed that there were more words and more time given to activists, celebrities, and influencers who don't know what's happening in Kentucky than there was giving the actual fact. I think what I saw this morning was a Bull Connor speech in 2020. And you're right. Unfortunately, it was being given by a black prosecutor.
And for you youngins out there, here is Bull Connor in 1963.
You've got to keep the white and the black separate. Let the law enforcement agencies, that's what you got them hired for. And the governor of the state of Alabama handle this thing. Now, George asked me to ask you to do that. Do him one favor. Tell your friends when you leave here between now and Tuesday, don't go up there. Leave it alone. They're going to handle this situation. Just leave it alone. You know, those Kennedys up there in Washington, that little old Bobby Sox and his brother, the president, they'd give anything in the world if we had some trouble here. If we don't have any trouble, we can beat them at your own game.
I'm holding in my baby brown libertarian fingers an article from the Washington Post, April 27, 2016, my birthday. Quote, Washington Post. Again, this is a left-wing newspaper that has never endorsed a Republican in their entire history. Quote, the conventional thinking about police-involved shootings and some research has been that black suspects are more likely to be shot than white suspects because of an implicit racial bias among police officers. But now, a new study has found exactly the opposite. Even with white officers who do have racial biases, officers are 3 times less likely, and they put less likely, by the way, in italics, meaning this is really something. Officers are 3 times less likely to shoot unarmed black suspects than unarmed white suspects. Officers are 3 times less likely, I know I speak quickly, 3 times less likely to shoot unarmed black suspects than unarmed white suspects. Is this thing on? Talks about the project done at Washington State using, quote, highly realistic police simulators, various scenarios, responds on large high-definition video screens in an attempt to recreate critical situations on the street. Officers are equipped with real guns, modified to fire infrared beams rather than bullets. By the way, it's the 3rd time they've done this. Each time, the results have been the same. Quote, all 3 times, as the Washington Post, they found that officers took significantly more time to fire their weapons if the subject was black, according to the latest report, which they've called the reverse racism effect. Significantly more time to fire their weapons if the subject was black. Now, the other day, I got a call from somebody, wasn't able to deal with it, who wanted to know how many officers who were killed by black people. Here's what the Post also says, quote, a 1978 report found that 60% of black suspects shot by the police carried handguns as opposed to 35% of white suspects. Let me read that again. A 1978 report found that 60% of black suspects shot by the police carried handguns compared with 35% of white suspects. In 2001, a study found that black people, who comprise 12% of the population, commit 43% of the killings of officers. A 1977 analysis of major metro departments found officers fired more shots at white suspects than black suspects, possibly because of, quote, public sentiment concerning treatment of blacks. 2004, a study at University of Missouri, St. Louis, interviewed more than 100 officers, found evidence of increased wariness about using deadly force against black suspects for fear of how it would be perceived and the associated consequences, end of quote. Is this thing on? Adjusting for the fact that there are fewer black scenarios, quote, we found that officers were slightly more than 3 times less likely to shoot unarmed black suspects than unarmed white suspects. One cop says the press always plays this thing up. But around here, I remember a time when I was menaced with a rifle. Whole time I was telling him, they're going to crucify me on the news tomorrow if I shoot this black guy in the back, so I didn't do it. They are less likely, more hesitant to use deadly force on a black person than a white person. I'm Larry Elder.